Thank you very, very much. And could I just say to everybody, welcome, and I'm so glad that you're able to join this session. My name is Pete Sharma, and excuse me, let me take you back to the title of this session. Okay, so here you are at Virtual Blended Learning, Understanding Your Role. And as I say, my name's Pete Sharma, and I'm really pleased to say that I've traveled a lot in my ELT career. And as you can see from this slide, made many a trip to the South American continent and loved joining in with caipirinhas and pisco sours and tequila in various countries. But I have to say, I'm very sorry that I've never actually visited Colombia, although thanks to Richmond, I was lucky enough to be able to take part at a distance in the Future of the ELT Profession Forum. The title of my session then was New Technology as an Agent of Change, and I'd just like you to take a look at that photograph there, which I used in my presentation. And before I start, could I just ask you to think for a second, do you know where that photograph was taken? Okay, I'll tell you the answer at the end of this session. Just to start with a few words about myself, I'm a director, a teacher trainer, and also a lecturer in EAP, which is English for academic purposes. I'm pretty well known, I would say, as an author in this field. And those are some of the things I've been lucky enough to be involved in. You'll see a book from a long, long time ago there called Blended Learning, Using Technology in and Beyond the Language Classroom. And the latest book that I'm a co-author of is Best Practices for Blended Learning. So let me say that the aim of this workshop is to explore how the principles of virtual blending can help teachers in their move to teaching online. The plenary session is divided into 4 parts. So first of all, I'm going to set the scene. Then I'll focus in on virtual blending itself. The central part will be full of practical ideas. I hope some of them will be of interest to you, and some of them maybe will be things that you could adapt in your own situations. And I'll finish off by just making some general reflections about where we are at the moment. So I'd like to share with you my website. You can see the address there. I'm sure there'll be a lot of information given out by Richmond, so you can easily get there. And just to say that I'll be blogging about this event. It's a way that you can get in touch with me. And also, if you'd like to have a handout from this talk, you can get it from there, and you'll have all the references and so on. So let's kick off with the very first part of the talk, when I'm going to set the scene. And in this part, I'll speak a little bit about blended learning, and then I'll move on to this shift between teaching in a classroom and actually delivering courses online. I have a question for you. Do you run blended learning courses? Now, one thing that you can do later on is to pause. If you rewatch this, you can pause and think about your answer. And when you have thought about it, please do get in touch with me. To do that, you'll just need to go to my website. You'll be able to vote using Mentimeter. And sometimes the answer is not so simple. So it would be great to hear from you. What is your answer to that question? Maybe it's quite a simple answer. Yes. Maybe you want to say, well, no. Or it's more complex. Before the pandemic, we used to do this, or we have plans for the future. It might be dependent on how you define blended learning. So feel free to write in an answer and start this really interesting dialogue to see who out there is actually running blended learning courses. So let's kick off with this key concept in language teaching. If you're interested in studying more about its definitions, there's a reference on the handout. This is from an article that I wrote, looking at the various definitions of the term. As you can see, there are multiple definitions. So conversations about blended learning can go in different directions depending on how you define it. A typical example of a definition will be that definition number 1. That's the classical definition. So in some way, you have part of your course in a bricks and mortar classroom, real, with your students in front of you, and that's combined with online learning. But as you can see from the slide, there are other definitions. Very typically would be combining different methodologies. There's one course book, for instance, had PPP style lessons in the morning, present, practice and produce, and then had TBL style lessons, task-based lessons in the afternoon, and they mix the methodology throughout the course. So I'll let you have a think. Which do you think that the students preferred? The more traditional approach or the, if you like, more up-to-date methodologically? And the feedback was very interesting because students actually enjoyed both kinds of lessons. Definition 3 shows you how I took my master's at Manchester University, which was combining different technologies. We used the internet, we had old-fashioned DVDs and videos as well. But what's interesting is that I never actually went physically to Manchester University. So in a way, in some senses, this is blended learning, a combination of technologies, but in another sense, it's not blended learning. So it is quite complicated. Basically, we're looking at that percentage in the middle, as you can see from the slide, somewhere between about 20-30% all the way across to something like 20%. So you can see right in the middle, you have hybrid learning, 50-50, classroom and online. And this is really what lots of people talk about when they speak about blended learning. Why blend? Well, that's a very, very interesting question. There are so many different reasons. One thing that it's worth considering is that even though we talk about blended learning, in fact, the concept is extremely flexible. It's always changing. Have a look at this picture. You can see someone there wearing a headset, and you can see that the students might be taking a course in a classroom, but also doing something in virtual reality outside of the classroom. So it's a very dynamic concept. And there are many reasons. Cost saving is one. There are also many, many challenges too. I've put a few on this slide. Have a look at the first one there, that the blended learning course failed to satisfy anybody's learning style. That's very interesting, isn't it? The first course I was involved in, the students had 6 hours each day. So we just cut the course in the middle, 3 hours in the morning. That's when you come to class, 3 hours in the afternoon. You don't have to come to class. You just work at home using the online materials. And at the end of the course, we have the feedback from the students. And unfortunately, all the students who loved coming to the classroom, they didn't ever contribute to the knowledge building which was happening online. And the students that loved online, they absolutely hated the timetable restriction that made them come to the classroom. So the feedback was really bad. It was quite interesting that it failed to satisfy either type of student. The second one there shows that the course is just a mishmash, this eclectic mix of lots of different things, a podcast here, a video here, but the students couldn't actually follow why all these things had been chosen. So they just thought that the course didn't have any underlying philosophy or principle. The common complaint on blended learning courses is that there's just no integration between what's happening in the classroom and what's happening online. Very typically, a student in class asks the teacher, how do you use the future? And the teacher gives an explanation of how the future is used. And then the next lesson, the student comes and says, excuse me, your explanation was different from the one on the disc. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because maybe the teacher had actually very little idea of what was actually going on in the online. So there's no real integration. So it's a very challenging thing to deliver a blended learning course. Lots of literature about it. I'd highly recommend the Cambridge Guide if you're interested in the theory. And that concludes that even though we know a lot about blended learning, we still need to do more research. So I've spoken a little bit here about blended learning. There are definitely ways that you can make it successful. And I've tried here to focus on 4 key factors: appropriacy, integration, attitude, and training. Of course, there may be more factors. One thing I'm thinking of at the moment is if you have to deliver a course, having robust technology is really, really useful. And in the past, the teacher in the classroom needn't use technology at all and still deliver blended learning. But in this new era that we're in now, technology is absolutely fundamental, and a teacher has to get over that hurdle. So let's take a look at these. You may be very familiar with this diagram showing time and place. So let's start with that green square. That's how I started teaching in Spain many years ago. If you're an historian, I'll tell you in my first teaching year, there was a coup d'etat. So if you think about that really hard, you can actually work out when I started teaching. And at the end of my lesson, I would say, okay, guys, see you next week. See you same time, same place in the classroom. Don't forget to do your homework. And at the end of 167 hours, my students would come back and I'd say, did you do your homework? And then they would say, no, I didn't have time. I was so busy. And so everything I taught last week, they'd pretty well forgotten, and we had to review it all again. So that was teaching in the past. But now, of course, with a learning management system, there are more options. Let's imagine you want to help your students with their speaking. Well, I would say, let's do that in the classroom. That's a great place to have a discussion. But if I ask a question to my students, like, I don't know, what do you think about this? The answers might be quite superficial. Oh, I think it's nice. And then the student goes home and says, nice? Nice? Is this all I could think of in this real time? So maybe it's actually better to post a question that involves critical thinking onto a forum. And then students have a lot longer to think about their answer, draft it, but not send it. Redraft it, and then finally post it and engage in a discussion which will help them. So it's more appropriate to look at critical thinking in a forum. It's more appropriate to do some things via email. Of course, you can still do things very quickly using platforms like WhatsApp, for instance, this kind of chatting that goes on. But basically, there are more options, and deciding where to do things appropriately in class or online, that's one of the secrets of a successful blended course. When we look at integration, integrating what students do in class with what they do with self-study, that's also a key factor. And I'll tell you a story about that. We wanted to try and help our students with self-study. Our students said, we don't want to have 30 minutes in the middle of the day without the teacher. We pay for the teacher, we pay for the teacher. And we said, okay, well, that's fine. So could you stand up and give me your PowerPoint? And the student would say, no, I'm not ready. Why? I haven't prepared my PowerPoint. Okay, do you want some time? Yes. How long do you want? 30 minutes. Okay, fine. I'll go away for 30 minutes. You prepare your PowerPoint. So we went away and we called that self-study. And of course, the students were very happy. Why? Because that task was completely integrated with the preparation. So what you're working on in the class, that can feed into how you set your self-study, and what the students do away, that feeds back into the lesson, and that can give you a great sense of complementarity or integration. We can have knowledge about blended learning, of which there are a lot in books, and also we can have skills, how to do it. But really, how you feel about something is more important than either your knowledge or your skills, your belief. And some of these are hidden. So teachers often say to me, Pete, I love blended learning. The problem is it doesn't actually work with my group. Wow, that's interesting, isn't it? And it tells you a lot about the teacher's attitude. So training will be the last thing to help your course go successfully. Training not only for teachers, but also for students. So we spent some time there looking at blended learning, but now let's bring ourselves right up to date and think about the last year, which has been so difficult for many classroom teachers. Suddenly, out of the blue, they've had to switch all of their delivery into online, and they've never done it before, maybe because of coronavirus. So I'm really addressing those teachers now. If you've suddenly found yourself teaching online, there's so much that you need to learn. But I would ask you to pause just for a moment and think what you're doing online is the first online delivery maybe for you as a teacher. But of course, online has been with us for many, many years. It has a complete history. It has its own theory and a lot of research. It's just that it's been accelerated for many people. And after a while, that will settle down and one begins to build stronger practices. So let's take a look at some of the challenges. I think for me, one of them is the fact that we get used to certain books. Maybe these will be familiar to you. You dig out your Harmer and you dig out what James Scrivener said and you learn about teaching. But really, you're learning mostly about classroom teaching. So you have to think, okay, well, actually, in distance, in online, there's a different set of material that we can access in order to help to learn about that. And one of the things I suggest when you first start is just to sit down with a piece of paper and write down all the things that are involved when you teach in a classroom. For me, I have to be honest and say I'm famous for walking in and moving all the furniture around because I just want my students to be sitting in certain places for different activities. And when you're online, you have to get to know another set of things, such as why the student's headset isn't working, for instance, and get involved in that discussion. And then the great thing is to write down a list of things that actually apply to both and notice how many things there are in the middle. The teacher's role as a motivator, or you're always giving in instructions, but you do that in both scenarios. And so you realize what you already do as a teacher, and then what you might do as a teacher, but what you then feel that you want to do differently. So yeah, sure, we always put our students in groups and pairs, and of course you can do that online, but it's different going into breakout rooms and learning how you might do that in an online environment. So let's bring the first part to a close now by saying that when we move to online, rather than thinking of it as a whole, online teaching, why not think of it as something that also involves two parts? This is our virtual blend. So the first part would be the live synchronous lesson, maybe 50 minutes long, sometimes an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. That's a long time online, but you can do that using a platform, typically the one that I'm using today, which is Zoom, for example. And the one I'll be using in May will be MS Teams. And then apart from the synchronous delivery, there is asynchronous delivery, all of the things that students can do, but not in real time, things that they can do using their learning platform. So that would be a good way into teaching online, viewing it as virtual blending, blending live synchronous with asynchronous delivery. So that really brings me to the end of the first part when I've just been setting the scene. So let's now move on and focus on this concept of virtual blending. And I'll just mention two ways to do this, which is, first of all, using a learning management system. And then I'll just speak a little bit about a course that I was involved in last summer where we flipped an EAP course, English for Academic Purposes course. So here we are. We're looking at virtual blending being this mixture of asynchronous and synchronous delivery. And I would just like to say, just because you have an LMS, it doesn't mean you have to use it in one way. One of the keys to all of this is flexibility. So a teacher could use their platform in different ways. Let's have a look at the first one, which is a lockstep way. This is how I am taking my yoga course. I'm doing the history of yoga, and it's 10 weeks long. And at the end of every week, the next week is released. So in week 1, I can't see weeks 2 to 10. And then at the end of week 2, week 3 is released. So the teacher keeps me in lockstep, and my course is drip fed to me week by week. Completely different is targeted. Think of 5 of your students, how different they are. So you notice that with student number 1, they really need listening. So you actually take that student and you say, Zhao, you need to work on your listening. You need to do this. Okay, and then you talk to Maria, and that's totally different. Maria, no problems with listening, but I've noticed this about your grammar. So what I'd like you to do is this. So you're working with Maria and she's working particularly on her grammar. So targeting a particular area for each student to do. And then you could choose an open access approach, which is, hi, I'm Pete. I'm your teacher. There is your LMS. It's open for you all the time. 24/7, you can do what you want, when you want. You decide. You go up and you've always got access to those materials. And that's a bit like the dual track approach, the teaching and then the students working on their online materials. So even though we have one LMS, the ways that you can use that learning management system vary considerably. And what I'd like to show in this part of the plenary is that many of the things that we want to work with our students are available to you now. You can use the LMS for differentiation, for personalizing courses, allowing them to have choice. And basically, for students to be successful in their learning, they need to develop their autonomy, and autonomous students take to blended learning quickest because they're already used to working independently from the teacher. So let's have a look at some examples of this. In terms of differentiation, you may have an exercise, but students may be able to access that exercise already at different levels. So they could choose if they would like to do an easier or a more difficult version of an exercise. Some students want to do extra work. They're super motivated. So let them. Great, you've got your materials, go and do those, do them extra. And also, if you want to know the answer, you really need to know the answer, you can always access that answer, check what it is. You've got scores so often in this type of material. So for students that love that competition, they can maybe get 60% and they say, next time I'm going to get 70. Next time I'm going to get 80, and just keep on doing that extra practice, and that can have a very beneficial effect on their learning. Some of the materials now today are so amazing in how they look. They're just fun. They're appropriate for those learners. They automatically motivate and engage you. And I think that's what we're looking for from this kind of digital material that students can use nowadays. One thing that has struck me recently is the power of the data that you can extract from these. I hadn't felt it until about, I'd say, a couple of years ago when I was sitting with students and I watched what they did. And when they worked, you can often see their first score, their last score, how often they attend. And it was so incredible to actually see that data that it immediately came back into my class. And I began to treat students in slightly different ways, getting them together to have tutorials and then talk about what they've been doing and how they're working on the platform. And that was truly insightful, because as language teachers in the classroom, we're not often used to seeing this objective kind of data that these rich systems can produce. So that was very, very interesting. So I've been really speaking about using an LMS. I'd just like to mention in this middle part a course that I was very heavily involved in last summer. Suddenly, we couldn't do our course in our university. The classrooms were closed. The students couldn't come. And we had to think, what are we going to do? Well, with this idea of flipping and this idea of teaching online, we housed some of the materials on a common platform. That was Moodle. We chose that because the university used that anyway. And then also we had to decide which online platform will we use for the teaching. And we all said, Zoom, Zoom, Zoom. We want to use Zoom. And the university said, yeah, okay, that's fine. But there may be security issues. And then suddenly one day we got a message that said, you can't use Zoom, you have to use Teams. And I went, no, this is the worst program ever devised in the whole history of the world. It's not even made for education. It's actually for business. And we had to use Teams. And it was interesting. At the beginning of the summer, I thought Teams is horrible. At the end of the summer, I thought, well, I can live with this because you get to know a certain kind of platform. So these are all important decisions that you as a school, you as a teacher will be making. What are you going to do? You can listen to people. Person one will say, Zoom is great. Person two will say, Teams is great. Person one will say Moodle is great. Someone else will say, I hate Moodle. This will be what you hear, and you have to make these kinds of decisions. So I would just like to say a very quick word about flipping, because at this conference, you have a session all about flipped learning. And it's really, really interesting, this idea that you change everything round. And so before you come to your live class, you have already listened to that video, for example, if you happen to be using authentic video. So there's a lot to say about flipping, but what I wanted to say is, what input will the students have? There's various choices. The first one is authentic input, such as here, it's a video. And the second one is you might like to adapt the input. You can use a program to take a video, you can pause it, you can add your teacher questions, so you can edit it in some way. Or you might like to do it yourself. You might like to say, this is what I always teach, so I'm going to record myself, like now in Zoom. I could record my presentation and then send it to the students. So there are various ways of doing this, but what's really interesting, and my main point is, teachers always thinking, what is your role here? What are you doing? And one thing that you might want to do when you're doing this kind of presenting is, do I want the materials to present, or do I want to do it myself? And these are critical questions. Sometimes the materials on the LMS teach. That's a very specific thing. It's to technology as a tutor, and it's very different from technology as a tool. So sorting this out in your mind is really, really important. So I'll give you just one example of this. For our summer, we decided that the materials would do the presentation. The materials would teach. So what we did was we did everything through the platform. The students rocked up, they took their course, they went to introductions, they did various things. But what was interesting is when they did anything on the platform, and the number of things you can do now are incredible using these kinds of creation tools like H5P. People a lot cleverer than I did created this course. But of course, I wanted to do my presentation. So there's me presenting something or other on the platform. And when the students work through the guided practice, they're always working through it, knowing they'll have to speak in the live lesson. So it moves in a way that finally you speak. So there was a logic underlying the course, and that's what all schools and teachers are looking for now. Don't worry about the technology. If the pedagogy is sound, the pedagogy is principled, the course will be a good course. So that was a great course that I was involved in. Not everybody can afford to do this kind of thing, create a course, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Okay, so I hope you're still alive. If you're not, you can, I think at some point, pause this video and go and have a cup of coffee and then come back later. But anyway, I'm going to move on to the third part now, which are the practical ideas. And so I've laid them out there, starting with grammar and vocabulary. And then we'll look at 3 of the 4 skills. And it's quite interesting that 2 of those skills are receptive skills, listening and reading, and one of them is speaking. And it's very, very interesting, that difference between productive and receptive, and how you decide to structure those in your course, whether it's live or using the online asynchronous platform. So let's kick off with grammar, and great area. And when I was just dealing with some of the questions that my students were asking me in class, one of my students, for some reason, went to messages and started to write to me. And they wrote, the actual was, I can't understand this. They were working with their platform. He just say he read, but doesn't if he has finished. And what this was that the student didn't understand the feedback from the platform. So the student had written that the reader didn't finish reading the short story, and the platform marked it wrong. And the student was, why is this wrong? So they started to communicate with me. Then they communicated with me again. They took a screenshot of what they were doing on the platform and said, look at this. And it made me think, wow, we've got this LMS. We traditionally think of grammar as being away from the class and the students doing their guided practice. And in the class, it's all about fluency. But it struck me that the messages are a fantastic tool on your platform for students, how easy it is to type something, to communicate with you. And what happened in this course was amazing, because students came to class saying, what's the difference between the past simple and the present perfect? And that was amazing, because if I walk into a class and say, guys, we're going to look at the difference between the simple past and the present perfect, most of my students go, oh, wow, how interesting is that? And they're not absolutely interested in grammar, but this was really fascinating. So just an idea for grammar teaching is to think it's not automatically obvious to the students why they get this kind of feedback from the platform and why they get this kind of feedback from the teacher, who obviously can engage with more grey areas. The platform looks at black and white areas, so blurring the two can be really great in terms of collaboration on your course. So let's move on to an idea for speaking. And I've already mentioned Mentimeter. Many of you will be used to using this voting tool in class, but how about using it between classes? In other words, you actually vote before you come to class and then use the class to show the results. So one possible vote would be, have you seen the film Lion? And your students say yes or no. And depending on their answers, you could arrange them in class with a yes person sitting next to a no person. I don't know if you've ever seen this film, but it deals with a young boy in India who is brought up in an orphanage, and then he's adopted by somebody from Australia. And when I look at this, I get a little tear in my eyes, because it's almost the same as my own life, because I was born in India. That's me there as a baby. And I was adopted in India. And so this is a really personal story for me. And that's just accidental. The course book didn't know that. And so when you spot these moments for personalization, it's a wonderful thing, I think, to bring into your classes. But also the point is to use these kinds of tools before class, so it's always linking the online and the face-to-face. Let's move on to vocabulary, and I'd like to show you this really interesting diagram, which is when you actually know a word, of course you don't know it automatically one day. You probably pass through a series of like a process. So I just read through those numbers there. Number one, I don't remember having seen the word before. Number two, I've seen it, but I don't know what it means. Now, number three is in the middle. I've seen it and I think it means. Number four is where you start to know the word. And then number five, you can actually use the word in a sentence. So obviously not every word progresses through each phase on this continuum. So I'm just going to show you a few words now, and I'd just like you to think about your own number for these words. And you won't see them for very long, but obviously if you watch the video again, you can pause it and spend longer looking at the screen. Let's just take one of those words, the first word, and just write your number down. And I would imagine, and this is what's fabulous with a class, is that people write 1, 2, 3. Some people might write 4. Somebody's even written 5, and that's a great moment to just step in and say, okay, you've put 3. What do you think it means? And then the student explains what they think it means. Or you could say, I see you've written 5. Could you explain it to the rest of the group? And the student goes, yeah, I'll explain it to the rest of the group. And this is a lovely activity that works well in the classroom with bits of paper, writing numbers, and it works well online using the chat. So let's move on. And listening, I think, really is the skill which has moved out of the classroom now. I remember saying, I'm going to play the tape twice. Some people watching this probably don't even know what that is in the left-hand corner. But certainly, I think everything I now do in my classroom is just strategy work, building for when the students can actually work on their listening away from the classroom. And an example of this was a couple of summers ago when my computer didn't work. I ran down the corridor. I got this guy to come in and help me fix the computer, sort out the technology. And I looked at the students. They hadn't even noticed. They'd taken out their smartphones and they were just listening because their smartphones and tablets were normalized to them. So in terms of online, I think it's great to do a lot of listening outside from the platform. Let students do the listening at home where they can listen once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, look up the words, and then in class, activate that in some way. And of course, there's so many ways of doing that, but the key point is that you've got the listening, but the students have the same listening. So in class, maybe you could just play it with no sound and then say, bye guys, see you next week, but for your self-study, go through it, listen, but then compare what you wrote with what's actually on the video, and then we'll talk about it in the next class. So we don't just plan now for one class. It's almost like we're planning for a cycle as we move through in class and outside. So this applies to reading, the other receptive skill as well. You have different reading skills and people want to look up more words or look up fewer words. So one fabulous example of reading away from the class is to work yourself through a maze. So each time you read something, you have an activity after that, or what's wonderful on the My On platform, which is part of the Richmond solution, is those words because you like, this use of algorithms. So they generate more things that you like. And I think that this use of the platform for self-study, for extensive reading is really, really important. There's no time to do extensive reading in your lesson. So this is a little sheet, a template that I've devised where people can do reading away from the class. And one idea would be to give some students text A. Here, the text is why online learning is better than face-to-face. And other students text B. Their text is why traditional classroom learning is better than online courses. And then in the class, students come together and discuss with each other their texts. So as you can see, in an online course like this, extensive reading can be done at your own speed and away from the class. This is appropriacy. So that really brings me towards the end of this plenary talk now. And I'm just going to finish off by just making a few reflections about some of the things that are happening at the moment. I think what I've really been saying is that for a long time now, people have been looking at this mixing of live and synchronous and asynchronous. We've been looking, Blender's got a long history. And so even though the move online has been quick for a lot of people, in fact, virtual blending could really leverage, if you like, the best of what we've been thinking about for a long time and give teachers this opportunity to optimize learning for people. I would say that context is absolutely critical. I spoke about a flipped EAP course, which may be very dissimilar from the context that you're working in, but you'll be thinking about your own context and what will be right and what will be the best pedagogical mix. I think that the virtual blend building it on the same principles as blended learning, those principles of appropriacy, integration, attitude, training, that can give you the best chance of being successful. And the benefits are really huge, I think, now. No class is homogenous. There are so many different people in there, and you, the teacher, get to know them really well, and allowing them these different choices of how and when they study can really benefit their learning. So it's a mad world. Hybrid learning is with us. When I set about preparing this session, I learned all about concurrent teaching. It sounds quite challenging for me, this idea that you have people in front of you in face masks, and then you look over to the right and there's a screen, and then you're waving to people. It sounds really challenging, but also there's a good aspect of it, which is allowing learning to be for everybody. And so this idea of Hyflex is actually working towards that. And if it looks chaotic, I would just point you to some of the work by Beth Alexander. She's someone you can track down through Twitter, but she said if you are faced with this, you could plan out your lesson in different chunks so that you're addressing the people in front of you for one part and then addressing people away from you for another. So it's quite an interesting moment that we're at, and it could be quite challenging. But I urge you really to think through all these things, because technology keeps moving. Artificial intelligence is around. Personalization, in one sense, personalization means one thing for tech people, which is the platform moves and personalizes the answers through to you on your vocab app. For a teacher, it means something else. It means using your students' first names, something that the LMS can't necessarily do. So all these things, like when smart teaching assistants come in, they're coming in all the time into our homes. And so students could say, for instance, how far is it to Mars? And I'll tell you one thing, that the AI would be a better better robot to answer that than me as a teacher. So teachers are always going to be challenged as to thinking about their role. And just to finish off, I'm talking to a lot of different people at the moment. I'm talking to teachers, but I'm also talking to school managers and academic managers, teacher trainers. There are many, many stakeholders involved in this area, and they have different views and different viewpoints. So this is why this talk is subtitled Know Your Role. Thinking through things are really important. One example is if I say, what do you think about digital materials? Teachers might give a completely different answer to students, because students are users. And somebody taking a master's course who's looking at the research will give a completely different answer to a teacher who has not taken a master's course, was not looking at that research in the same way, because they're very much involved in the practicalities. So it often takes a lot of thinking through, and I think that is really my message. So thank you guys very, very much for listening. The aim of this talk really was to explore the principles of virtual blending and how they can help you. And just to sum up the key takeaways, I would say the first one is blended learning is the principled combination of modes, and that the principles of virtual blending can really help us now in this new online world. It's really good to know your role and the role of the technology and how that may change. For instance, in Flipped, is it the technology that's teaching, or is it you? Are you comfortable with the presentation on the technology? Always thinking through these roles. And to finish off, I think when we looked at the feedback from the course last year, the main thing was we loved the materials, but we loved the teacher. It's the teacher's activation of those materials that caused the course to be successful. So I think in the world of AI, that's pretty good news for everybody. So I promised to tell you where I took this. Many of you may have guessed it already. It's from Mexico City. I took this beautiful photograph and I love it because the house on the left was one of my favorite painters, Diego, lived. And the house on the right, I think I've got that right, that's where Frida Kahlo lived. And she would take his coffee across the bridge in the morning so he would have it. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor for blended learning. It's one house, one whole, but within that house are the two separate parts, and they are joined together and work together in harmony. So to finish on a personal note, I'm divorced, and I'm sure that if I had a house like Diego and Frida, I wouldn't be divorced now because we'd have had our separate areas to live in. So thanks very much, guys. That's my email just once again, because I'll be continuing the conversation with you. So I'd just like to say thank you so much to everybody. Thank you very, very much to Richmond